History whispers to us through the ashes of countless pyres, through the screams that once echoed in public squares, and through the records of trials where justice wore the mask of terror. The witch hunts that swept across Europe and the Americas from the 15th to the 18th centuries were not merely episodes of religious fervor, they were systematic campaigns of gender-based violence, cloaked in the language of divine righteousness and social protection. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft during this dark period, and historians estimate that 75 to 80% of them were women. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were the manifestation of deep-seated misogyny, economic anxieties, and the fatal combination of superstition and institutional power. In this video, we'll descend into the abyss of humanity's capacity for cruelty. We'll explore the specific tortures and punishments devised for women accused of witchcraft, each method more ingenious in its sadism than the last. Stay with us as we uncover these harrowing practices, examining not just the mechanics of torture, but the psychology of fear, the politics of persecution, and the voices of those who suffered. This is the story that history tried to burn away. Before we examine the punishments themselves, we must understand the machinery of accusation that fed the witch trials. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer provided a pseudo-legal and theological framework for identifying, prosecuting and executing suspected witches. This infamous text declared that women were more susceptible to demonic influence due to their weak nature and carnal lust. It wasn't just a book, it was a manual for misogyny, providing interrogation techniques, torture protocols, and legal justifications for the systematic persecution of women. The profile of a typical witch trial victim reveals the true nature of these persecutions. She was often elderly, widowed and poor, a woman without male protection in a patriarchal society. She might have been a healer with knowledge of herbs, a midwife who attended difficult births, or simply a woman who spoke too freely or refused to conform. Economic factors played a crucial role. In Germanic regions, property seizure was legal after conviction, creating financial incentives for accusations. Neighbors could acquire land, settle debts, or eliminate competition by crying witch. Social tensions, crop failures, livestock deaths, or unexplained illnesses needed scapegoats, and vulnerable women fit the bill perfectly. The accusation itself was a death sentence in slow motion. Once named, a woman entered a labyrinth from which few emerged alive. The trial process was designed not to establish innocence, but to extract confession through systematic torture. And the tortures were where human imagination turned monstrous. The swimming test, also known as ordeal by water, was one of the most perversely logical methods used to determine guilt in witchcraft cases. This trial by ordeal operated on a theological paradox that sealed the accused woman's fate before she ever touched the water. The process was brutally simple. The accused woman was bound in a specific way, right thumb tied to left big toe, left thumb to right big toe, creating a cross-like position that was believed to invoke divine judgment. She was then stripped to her undergarments, ostensibly to remove any charms or magical objects, but in reality to add humiliation to the ordeal. A rope was tied around her waist, and she was thrown or lowered into a body of water, a pond, river, or specially constructed pit. The theological reasoning was chillingly circular. Pure water, blessed by God, would reject an evil witch, causing her to float. An innocent woman, accepted by the pure water, would sink. But here's the fatal trap. If she floated, she was deemed guilty and faced execution, usually by burning. If she sank, proving her innocence, she often drowned before she could be pulled up, or suffered such trauma that she died shortly after. The rope was sometimes deliberately given slack, ensuring that proof of innocence came at the cost of life itself. The case of Mary Sutton in 1612 Bedford, England, exemplifies this horror. Contemporary records note that she was swum multiple times, and though she repeatedly sank, which should have proven her innocence, the examiners declared that she had used witchcraft to make herself sink. She was executed anyway. Reverend Francis Hutchinson, writing in 1718 in his historical essay concerning witchcraft, condemned the practice. The vulgar experiments of swimming suspected persons in water, and the like cruel methods, have no foundation either in scripture or reason. But his criticism came too late for the countless women who had already perished in the water's cruel embrace. The swimming test wasn't just about determining guilt, it was public spectacle, a form of entertainment that reinforced community bonds through collective participation in violence. Crowds would gather, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, to watch these ordeals. The psychological torture of being dragged before your neighbors, stripped, bound, and thrown into water while they cheered or jeered, cannot be overstated. The swimming test persisted well into the 18th century in some regions, with the last recorded instance in England occurring in 1825, when an elderly woman named Anne Izard was swum in the village of Great Paxton. She survived the ordeal but died shortly after from the shock and exposure. Among the most insidious methods used to prove witchcraft was the search for the devil's mark, an allegedly supernatural blemish where the accused had supposedly sealed her pact with Satan. This practice combined invasive physical examination with pseudoscience, transforming normal human bodies into evidence of evil. Professional witch prickers emerged across Scotland and England, men who claimed expertise in identifying these marks. They were paid per conviction, creating a perverse financial incentive for finding evidence. Matthew Hopkins, England's self-proclaimed witchfinder general, employed teams of women to strip-search accused witches, looking for any blemish, birthmark, mole or scar that could be deemed supernatural. The examination process was itself a form of torture. Women were stripped naked and every inch of their bodies scrutinized by strangers. Their hair was shaved to reveal any hidden marks. They were forced to stand while multiple examiners probed their skin with pins, needles and specially designed bodkins, sharp instruments that could be pressed deeply into the flesh. The test relied on a simple but flawed principle. The devil's mark would not bleed or feel pain when pierced. In reality, prickers often used retractable needles, instruments where the blade withdrew into the handle upon pressure, creating the illusion of penetration without actually piercing the skin. This theatrical deception proved the presence of insensate spots condemning innocent women. But even when prickers used genuine needles, they could exploit natural physiology. Scar tissue, moles and birthmarks often have reduced sensation. A woman in shock, terrified and humiliated might not react to pain in expected ways. Examiners would prick repeatedly until they found a spot with reduced sensation or bleeding, then declare it supernatural. The case of Isabel Gowdy in Scotland, 1662, illustrates the horror of this process. Records indicate she was pricked in sundry places over the course of hours. She eventually confessed to witchcraft, a confession that included fantastical claims of flying and shape-shifting, clearly extracted under duress. Historians believe she was executed, though the exact record of her death has been lost to time. In Scotland, the witch pricker John Kincaid became infamous for his work in the 1660s. He travelled from town to town, earning fees for each mark he found. It's estimated he was involved in dozens of executions. His career ended only when another woman he examined was found to have no unusual marks. She was released, and questions about his methods began to circulate. The pricking practice represents something particularly sinister, the weaponization of women's own bodies against them. Every natural variation in skin, every blemish that makes us human, could become evidence of evil. It transformed the intimate and personal into the public and damning. Not all torture left visible scars. Sleep deprivation, euphemistically called waking the witch, was a psychological torture technique that could break the strongest spirit without leaving marks that might trouble conscience-stricken witnesses. This method understood something fundamental. The human mind, when deprived of rest, becomes its own torturer. The process was methodical. The accused was prevented from sleeping for days, sometimes exceeding a week. Whenever she began to doze, guards or appointed watchers would physically rouse her, shaking her, walking her around the cell, or in some cases causing her pain. The Scottish practice involved forcing the accused to walk continuously for 24 to 48 hours, hence the term walking the witch. Matthew Hopkins documented this technique extensively. He wrote that witches must be kept from sleep, as during sleep their familiar spirits, demons in animal form, would come to suckle at their devil's marks. By preventing sleep, he claimed, he could both gather evidence by catching these familiars and weaken the witch's resistance to confession. The reality was far more sinister than his justifications. Modern sleep research has shown that after 72 hours without sleep, the human brain begins to hallucinate. But perhaps most disturbing were the watchers, often local women hired to prevent the accused from sleeping. These women, sometimes neighbors or even friends of the accused, were paid a small fee to participate in this torture. The witch trials didn't just punish the accused, they corrupted entire communities, turning neighbor against neighbor. In Scotland, the practice was even more brutal. The accused might be placed in the witch's bridle or scold's bridle, a metal cage around the head with a spiked plate forcing the tongue down while being kept awake. This dual torture prevented both sleep and speech, isolating the victim in a prison of exhaustion and pain. The Reverend George Gifford, writing in 1593 in his dialogue concerning witches and witchcraft, questioned these methods. Is it not a strange way of trying to rack and torment poor creatures to make them confess that which they never did? Yet his protests were largely ignored. The machinery of accusation needed confessions, and sleep deprivation delivered them efficiently and invisibly. Sleep deprivation represents psychological warfare at its most calculated. It doesn't merely break the body, it fractures reality itself, transforming the victim's own mind into an interrogation chamber from which there is no escape. The witch's chair, distinct from but related to the iron chair used in secular tortures, was a restraint device designed specifically for accused witches. These chairs came in various forms across different regions, but they shared a common purpose: to immobilize the accused while subjecting her to prolonged interrogation, exposure, and sometimes additional tortures. The basic witch's chair was a heavy wooden seat with armrests and a high back, fitted with iron bands and leather straps to secure the victim's wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. Once strapped in, the accused was completely immobilized, unable to move or escape. She might be left in this position for hours or even days during interrogation sessions. In some German regions, particularly Bamberg and Würzburg, where witch trials were especially severe in the 1620s, the chairs were modified with spikes on the seat and backrest. The victim would be pressed against these spikes, and as exhaustion set in and muscles weakened, her own body weight would drive the spikes deeper into her flesh. The Bamberg witch trials of 1626 to 1631 were particularly notorious. Under Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim, known as the Witch Bishop, over 600 people were executed for witchcraft. Johannes Junius, a former mayor, wrote a smuggled letter to his daughter from prison describing the tortures. "They stripped me, bound me and put me on the torture chair. They thumbscrewed me until the blood ran from under the nails." Though Junius was male, his testimony reveals the methods used on countless women. The letter continues, "When I said I knew nothing, they threatened to torture me again until I confessed. I thought it better to die once than many times, so I confessed what they wanted." He was burned at the stake shortly after. A variation of the restraint torture involved the witch's cradle, a wooden box or confined space where the accused was placed in a severely cramped position. Unable to stretch or move, the victim would develop excruciating muscle cramps, joint pain, and eventually nerve damage. This torture left no visible marks but caused unbearable suffering. The restraint chair served multiple purposes in the witch trial process. First, it allowed prolonged interrogation without giving the accused any opportunity for rest or escape. Second, it facilitated other tortures. The thumbscrews, leg vices, or branks could be applied while the victim was secured. Third, it functioned as psychological warfare, with the accused forced to stare at the interrogators and torture instruments while contemplating what was to come. In the Scottish witch trials, a practice called the boots was sometimes used in conjunction with restraint chairs. Wooden or iron boots would be fitted to the accused's legs, and wooden wedges would be hammered between the boot and the leg, crushing the bone. The victim, strapped in a chair and unable to escape, could only endure the systematic destruction of her limbs. The case of Gellis Duncan in Scotland, 1590, demonstrates the escalation of restraint torture. She was initially placed in the witch's chair for questioning. When she didn't confess, her head was thrawed, twisted with a rope, and her fingers were crushed in the Pillowink's thumbscrews. She eventually confessed and was strangled and burned. Her testimony under torture implicated dozens of others in what became known as the North Berwick witch trials. What makes restraint tortures particularly insidious is their ability to transform time itself into an instrument of suffering. Strapped immobile for hours, unable to relieve oneself, to scratch an itch, or to adjust position, the victim's own body becomes a prison. Every minute stretches into eternity. Every sensation becomes magnified, and all the while, the interrogators ask their questions, waiting for the moment when the will finally breaks. Of all the punishments inflicted on accused witches, none captures the imagination and horror quite like burning at the stake. This method of execution, favoured particularly in continental Europe and Scotland, was chosen not merely for its lethality, but for its symbolic weight. Fire was believed to purify, to cleanse the community of evil, and to serve as a visible warning to others. The process began with the construction of the pyre, a platform of wood and combustible materials built in a public square or field. The accused was brought forth, often after days of torture and imprisonment, weakened and terrified. In many cases, she would be forced to wear a special garment, a shift soaked in sulfur or pitch to ensure the flames would catch quickly. She was then bound to the stake, sometimes sitting on a small platform, sometimes standing, sometimes suspended slightly above the ground. The method varied by region and by the mercy or lack thereof of the executioners. In some places, a small bag of gunpowder would be tied around the victim's neck as a gesture of mercy. The explosion would kill quickly before the flames reached the body, but mercy was rarely the goal. The burning of witches was theatre, a public demonstration of authority and divine justice. Crowds numbered in the hundreds or thousands. People would travel from neighbouring villages to witness the spectacle. Children were brought to learn the consequences of evil. The condemned would often be forced to make a final confession or proclamation, another chance for authority to extract submission, even at the moment of death. Joan of Arc remains the most famous victim of this punishment, but she was far from alone. In the German city of Würzburg, between 1626 and 1631, during the height of the Würzburg witch trials, approximately 900 people were burned at the stake. Among them were children as young as 7 years old, accused alongside their mothers. The Würzburg trials left detailed records, giving us a horrifying window into the scale of these executions. One document lists 29 burnings in a single session, with multiple victims burned simultaneously to save wood and time. The list includes the wife of the baker, the daughter of Dr. Brown, the fairest maid in Würzburg, reducing human beings to brief descriptors before their deaths. In Scotland, the law specified burning for convicted witches, though the practice often included strangulation before burning as a mercy, if the executioner was willing and the family could pay for it. However, records indicate that many were burned alive. The case of Janet Horne in 1727, the last person executed for witchcraft in the British Isles, is particularly tragic. An elderly woman with a cognitive impairment, she was stripped, covered in tar, and burned alive in Dornoch, Scotland. The physical reality of burning was more horrific than most imagine. Death by fire is not instantaneous. Smoke inhalation might cause unconsciousness before the flames reached the body, but if the wind blew the wrong way or the fire built slowly, the victim could remain conscious through minutes of unimaginable agony. The smell of burning flesh, the sounds of screaming, these were the sensory experiences that communities gathered to witness. The ashes and remains were often scattered or disposed of in rivers to prevent any possibility of the witch returning or her remains becoming objects of sympathy or reverence. Even in death there was to be no dignity, no memorial, no acknowledgement of humanity. Pierre de Lancre, a French witch hunter who operated in the Basque region in the early 1600s, wrote extensively about the burnings he oversaw. He describes them with disturbing casualness. "We burned them in large numbers, and the air was full of smoke for days." His writings reveal not remorse but pride. These executions were seen as civic improvements, cleansing the community. The burning of witches was justified through religious and legal frameworks, but underneath the theology was something more primal, the assertion of control through terror. When a woman stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, whether through knowledge, independence, or simple misfortune, the flames awaited, and everyone was made to watch. While the rack is often associated with secular torture and political prisoners, it was also employed in witch trials, particularly in regions where religious and political authority overlapped. This device, designed to systematically dislocate every major joint in the human body, represented the pinnacle of scientific torture, controlled, gradual, and devastating. The rack's operation was brutally straightforward. The victim was laid on a wooden frame and her wrists and ankles were bound to separate rollers at each end. As the interrogator turned the crank, the rollers would pull in opposite directions, stretching the body beyond its natural limits. The first turns would create uncomfortable tension. Continued cranking would cause joints to separate, ligaments to tear, and eventually bones to dislocate with audible pops. The Tower of London housed one of England's most famous racks, and while most of its victims were male political prisoners, records indicate that at least 2 women accused of witchcraft were subjected to it. Anne Askew, though technically charged with heresy rather than witchcraft, was racked in 1546 until her limbs were pulled from their sockets. She had to be carried to her execution because she could no longer walk. What made the rack particularly effective for extracting confessions was its gradual nature. Unlike sudden tortures that might cause immediate unconsciousness, the rack allowed interrogators to pause at any point, to ask questions while the victim was in agony, but still conscious and able to speak. The promise of stopping the torture in exchange for confession was almost irresistible. In continental Europe, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire territories, the rack was often combined with other tortures. After being stretched on the rack, victims might have hot irons applied to already dislocated joints, or be subjected to strappado, being hung by their dislocated arms. This combination of tortures could turn the human body into a map of suffering. The case of Magdalena Weixler in 1600s Bavaria illustrates the rack's use in witch trials. Accused of causing crop failures through witchcraft, she was subjected to the rack 3 separate times over a week. Court records note that after the second session, she could not stand or walk. She confessed on the third session, implicating several other women. She was subsequently burned at the stake. The psychological dimension of the rack cannot be overstated. Victims could see the device before the torture began, anticipating the pain to come. During the torture, they could watch their own bodies being destroyed, joint by joint. The sound of their own ligaments tearing, the sensation of joints separating, these became memories that for those who survived would haunt them forever. Johannes Meifert, a German theologian writing in 1635, condemned the use of torture in witch trials, specifically mentioning the rack. They stretch them upon the rack until their joints burst apart, and yet they call this godly work. His treatise, Christliche Erinnerung, Christian Remembrance, was one of the few contemporary voices challenging these practices, but his warnings went largely unheeded. The rack's lasting impact extended beyond the torture chamber. Those who survived, and many did not, were often permanently disabled. Dislocated joints might be roughly reset but never fully heal. Torn ligaments meant chronic pain and limited mobility. Women who had been racked and then released, usually because they confessed and named others, thus becoming valuable witnesses, lived the rest of their lives in physical agony, their broken bodies a constant reminder of their ordeal. The rack represents the cold logic of systematic torture, the belief that sufficient pain, properly applied, can extract any desired confession. It transformed interrogation into engineering, with the human body as the material to be bent and broken until it yielded the required result. In English and colonial American law, there existed a torture so brutal that it was technically not considered torture at all. Peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, was applied to those who refused to enter a plea in court. While not exclusively used in witch trials, several women accused of witchcraft were subjected to this horrific ordeal when they refused to plead. Knowing that a trial would result in conviction and property seizure, the procedure was precise and methodical. The accused was laid on her back on the ground or a wooden platform. A board was placed across her chest. Then slowly, systematically, heavy stones were added to the board, one at a time. The weight would gradually crush the chest cavity, making each breath more difficult than the last. The process could last hours or even days. As the weight increased, ribs would begin to crack, internal organs would be compressed. Each breath became a battle against the crushing pressure. The accused could end the torture at any time by agreeing to plead, but pleading meant trial, conviction, and having all property seized, leaving their family destitute. The most famous case is that of Giles Corey in Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. Though male, his ordeal exemplifies the practice. At age 80, accused of witchcraft, he refused to plead. Records from Sheriff George Corwin describe how Corey was pressed for 2 days. The theological and legal reasoning behind this punishment reveals its true purpose. It wasn't primarily about extracting confession, or even about punishment. It was about property. In English law, a convicted felon's property was forfeit to the Crown. By refusing to plead and technically remaining unconvicted, the accused could ensure that their property passed to their heirs rather than being seized. This created a perverse equation. Die slowly, in agony, but save your family from destitution, or enter a plea, face a rigged trial, be executed anyway, and leave your family with nothing. That some chose the crushing death over the plea speaks volumes about the certainty of conviction in witch trials and the economic devastation that accompanied them. The practice was officially abolished in England in 1772, though it had fallen out of use decades earlier. The scavenger's daughter, invented in the reign of Henry VIII, represented the inverse of the rack. Where the rack stretched the body apart, the scavenger's daughter compressed it. This A-frame-shaped metal device forced the victim into a crouched position, bringing knees to chest, and then tightening metal bands to compress the body into an impossibly small space. The pressure was immense. As the device tightened, the victim's ribs would press against her thighs, compressing the chest and making breathing difficult. Blood would be forced into the head and extremities, causing the face to swell and turn purple. Some victims experienced hemorrhaging from the nose, ears, and fingertips as the pressure became unbearable. Though the scavenger's daughter was primarily a Tower of London device used on political and religious prisoners, records indicate that women accused of witchcraft were occasionally subjected to it, particularly when other methods had failed to extract confessions. The device was considered a gentleman's torture. It left fewer visible marks than the rack or whipping, making it useful when authorities wanted a confession without obvious evidence of coercion. The brank or scold's bridle was a different kind of torture, one aimed specifically at controlling women's speech. This iron cage fitted over the head with a spiked or bladed plate that pressed down on the tongue. Any movement of the tongue or jaw would drive the spikes deeper, making speech impossible and even swallowing difficult. While the brank was typically used as punishment for scolds, women deemed quarrelsome or gossipy, it was also employed in witch trials. The accused might be forced to wear it during transportation to trial, during public displays, or as a preliminary punishment before more severe torture. Some branks were decorated with asses' ears or devil horns, adding public humiliation to the physical torment. In Scotland, the brank saw particularly widespread use. Records from the town of Forfar show multiple instances of accused witches being branked before trial. Bessie Skebister in Orkney, 1633, was forced to wear the brank for 3 days before her trial began. The torture was designed to weaken her resolve and demonstrate the authorities' control before formal proceedings even commenced. The symbolism of the brank is particularly significant. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about silencing. In a society where women's primary crime was often speaking freely, expressing opinions or defending themselves verbally, the brank represented the ultimate suppression. It transformed the mouth, the organ of speech and self-expression, into a site of pain. Not all witch trial ordeals involved over-torture. Some operated under the guise of scientific testing, using apparently objective measurements to determine guilt or innocence. These pseudo-scientific methods were no less deadly for their veneer of rationality. In fact, their claim to objectivity made them more dangerous, lending false legitimacy to persecution. The practice of weighing accused witches was particularly popular in the Netherlands. The logic was absurd but widely believed. Witches, in order to fly to their Sabbaths, must have made themselves unnaturally light. Therefore, a woman who weighed too little for her size was clearly guilty. The town of Oldwater became famous for its witch weighing house, where women could be officially weighed and receive a certificate of their proper weight. Ironically, Oldwater's scale became known for its accuracy and fairness. Records show that between 1600 and the 1700s, all women weighed there received certificates stating they weighed appropriately, thus saving them from accusation. But this was the exception. In other locations, the weighing test was simply another rigged trial where the outcome was predetermined. We've already discussed the swimming test, but it bears emphasizing how widespread this practice became. From Scotland to New England, from Germany to England, accused witches were thrown into water. Another pseudo-scientific test involved having the accused recite prayers or scripture. The theory held that a witch, being in league with the devil, would be unable to speak holy words. In practice, this meant that a terrified, traumatized woman, possibly tortured and sleep-deprived, would stumble over complex Latin prayers she might never have fully learned in the first place. Sarah Good in Salem provides a tragic example. When asked to recite the commandments, she stumbled and made errors. This was cited as evidence of her witchcraft. The fact that she was an impoverished, possibly mentally ill woman with little formal education was irrelevant. Her inability to perfectly recite scripture became proof of demonic influence. The touch test was another supposed scientific method. The theory, supported by no less a figure than King James I of England in his book Daemonology, was that if a witch touched her victim, the victim's symptoms would cease. Conversely, if a victim touched the accused witch, the victim would immediately feel relief, or the witch would show visible signs of guilt. This test was used frequently in Salem. Multiple accusers would be brought into the presence of the accused. If they had fits or seizures, and then calmed when the accused touched them, this was considered proof of witchcraft. The obvious psychological and social dynamics at play, the power of suggestion, the pressure to perform, the fear of being accused oneself, were ignored in favor of this evidence. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of these pseudo-scientific tests was how they gave a veneer of rationality to irrational persecution. They allowed communities to believe they were being fair, following proper procedures, seeking objective truth. The accused wasn't being murdered by superstition, she was being tested by science, tried by law, executed by justice. But these tests were nothing more than theatrical performances of legitimacy. They transformed arbitrary violence into sanctioned procedure, made systematic persecution appear as rational process. In doing so, they made the witch trials not less horrific but more, because they allowed entire communities to participate in murder while maintaining the fiction that they were simply following the evidence where it led. One of the most harrowing aspects of the witch trials was how they ensnared entire families. When a woman was accused of witchcraft, her children were often accused alongside her. This wasn't incidental, it was strategic. Authorities understood that the threat to a woman's children was one of the most effective tortures imaginable. In Bamberg, Germany, during the trials of the 1620s, children as young as 7 were executed for witchcraft. The logic was that they had been corrupted by their witch mothers, initiated into the demonic arts at a tender age. But the reality was more pragmatic. Children could be coerced into testifying against their parents, providing the accusations and evidence that adult neighbors might hesitate to offer. The Würzburg trials show this pattern clearly. Among the executed were multiple children, listed in records simply by age, a girl of 12 years, a boy of 9 years. These children were not adult criminals capable of forming evil intent. They were casualties of a system that viewed witchcraft as hereditary, passing from mother to child like a disease. Mothers accused of witchcraft faced an impossible choice: confess and implicate yourself, potentially saving your children, or maintain innocence and watch your children be tortured for testimony. Had Katharina been poor and without influential family, her fate would have been the pyre. This highlights another dimension of familial torture, the arbitrary nature of it. Whether you lived or died often depended not on your guilt or innocence, but on whether your family had resources to mount a defense. In Salem, accusations spread through family lines. Sarah Good was accused along with her 4-year-old daughter Dorcas. The child was imprisoned for 9 months, interrogated, and according to records, confessed to having a familiar spirit. Dorcas Good survived but was reportedly mentally damaged by the experience, her childhood shattered by months in chains witnessing her mother's persecution. The psychological warfare extended beyond direct torture. Authorities would tell accused women that their children had already confessed, that they had named their mothers as witches. Whether true or false, these claims were designed to break the accused's spirit. How could a mother maintain innocence when told her own child had testified against her? Conversely, children were told their mothers had confessed and implicated them. The family bonds that should have provided strength became weapons, trust was weaponized, love became leverage. The witch trials didn't just destroy individuals, they destroyed families, severing the bonds between generations through orchestrated betrayal. Some children were orphaned by the trials, their parents executed, and their extended family too terrified to take them in for fear of being accused by association. These orphans became wards of the state, or were apprenticed to families, often in conditions of near servitude. They carried the stigma of witch blood throughout their lives, a mark of shame that could never be erased. The familial dimension of witch trial torture reveals the social scope of these persecutions. They weren't isolated incidents affecting only the accused. They were community-wide traumas that destroyed family structures, turned children against parents, and left scars that persisted for generations. The witch trials tortured not just individuals, but entire family trees. Among the most psychologically devastating aspects of witch trials was the acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit or spectral shape had been seen performing malevolent acts. This created a form of torture more insidious than any physical device. The accused was required to defend herself against accusations of crimes she couldn't possibly have witnessed or defended against. The logic of spectral evidence was circular and inescapable. An accuser would claim that while they were in their home or bed, the spectral form of the accused appeared to them, tormenting them or attempting to get them to sign the devil's book. The accused's actual physical location at the time was irrelevant. The theory held that witches could send forth their spectral shapes while their bodies remained elsewhere. How does one defend against such accusations? If you were home in bed, witnesses could testify to that fact, but it didn't matter. The accusation wasn't that your body committed the crime, but that your spirit did. Any alibi was rendered meaningless. Any character witness was irrelevant. You were guilty of crimes you couldn't have committed because they occurred in a realm where physical reality didn't apply. However, other religious authorities disagreed. Increase Mather, Cotton's father, warned that spectral evidence was unreliable, famously writing, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person should be condemned." His treatise, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, helped turn the tide against spectral evidence, but only after dozens had already been executed. The psychological torture of spectral evidence accusations was profound. The accused couldn't rely on logic, reason, or evidence to prove innocence. The very framework of proof had been subverted. Witnesses who would have testified to the accused's good character found their testimony meaningless against claims of supernatural evil. Bridget Bishop, the first person executed in Salem, faced multiple spectral evidence accusations. Witnesses claimed her spectre had visited them, tormented them, tried to coerce them into sin. At her trial, she protested, "I am no witch, I am innocent, I know nothing of it." But against the chorus of spectral accusations, her protests were useless. She was hanged on June 10, 1692. The acceptance of spectral evidence represents the ultimate corruption of justice. It removed any possibility of innocence. It transformed the legal system from a mechanism for determining truth into a theatre for predetermined conclusions. The horror of the witch trials didn't end with death. The treatment of executed bodies, the seizure of property, and the systematic erasure of memory added final insults to the ultimate injury. The witch trials aimed not just to kill, but to erase, to remove the accused from the community so thoroughly that even her memory would be tainted. In many regions, the property of convicted witches was forfeit to the crown or to the local authorities. This created perverse financial incentives throughout the witch trial system. Accusers might gain property or settle debts. Officials received fees for arrests, trials, and executions. Even the executioners were paid per killing. The witch trials weren't just about superstition, they were profitable. The costs of trial and execution were often charged to the accused's estate. Families of executed witches received bills for the rope used to hang their mother, the firewood to burn her, the guard's wages while she was imprisoned. The message was clear: not only had the accused been judged evil, but her very existence had been an expensive burden to the community. The case of the Aldern witches in Scotland, 1662, shows this economic dimension clearly. After execution, a detailed account was kept of all costs. For 10 loads of coal to burn them, £3.6 8. For a tar barrel, 14 shillings. For tows rope, 6 shillings. The witches' estates were charged for their own deaths, leaving their families not only bereaved but bankrupt. Bodies of executed witches were treated with contempt. Those burned at the stake had their ashes scattered or thrown in rivers to prevent any remains becoming objects of sympathy or veneration. Those hanged were often denied burial in consecrated ground. Some were buried at crossroads, locations associated with spiritual confusion and wandering ghosts, or in unmarked graves outside the churchyard walls. In England and Scotland, there was a belief that witches should not be buried in Christian ground. Their bodies became final objects of persecution, denied even the dignity of proper funeral rites. Family members were often prohibited from mourning publicly or marking graves, for fear of being associated with witchcraft themselves. The erasure extended to memory. In many communities, efforts were made to strike the names of executed witches from official records, to remove them from church rolls, to literally erase them from history. This wasn't just about the individual, it was about contaminating their entire legacy, ensuring that their families would carry the stain of witch blood for generations. Children of executed witches faced lifelong stigma. They might be denied apprenticeships, refused marriage into respectable families, or prevented from owning property. The sins of the mother, manufactured though they were, became hereditary curses that followed bloodlines across generations. Yet some communities did eventually recognize their injustice. Massachusetts formally apologized for the Salem witch trials in 1957. In 2004, Helena Scheiberin, executed in 1485 in Memmingen, Germany, was officially exonerated. Individual European towns have erected memorials, offered pardons, and acknowledged the innocent victims of witch persecution. These gestures, however, came centuries too late for the women who suffered. They cannot undo the burnings, the drownings, the crushing, the torture. They cannot restore the shattered families or resurrect the erased memories, but they do represent a crucial acknowledgement. These women were innocent. The trials were unjust. The persecutions were crimes. The treatment of bodies and the seizure of property reveal the witch trials' full scope. They weren't just about eliminating individuals deemed threatening. They were systematic campaigns that destroyed families economically, socially, and spiritually. The persecutions aimed at total erasure, making the accused disappear not just from life, but from history itself. Today, scattered across Europe and America, are quiet memorials to these women. They stand in contrast to the spectacle of the executions. Subdued, respectful, acknowledging rather than condemning, they represent our collective attempt to remember what our ancestors tried so hard to forget. We've journeyed through darkness, through swimming tests and pricking needles, through crushing stones and burning pyres, through sleep deprivation and spectral accusations. Each method we've examined represents not merely a form of torture but a window into the societies that created them. These punishments reveal a civilization's capacity for cruelty when fear is weaponized, when misogyny is institutionalized, and when power is unchecked. The women who suffered these tortures were not witches, they were herbalists, midwives, widows, outcasts, and simply women who lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were victims of economic anxieties, religious conflicts, and a legal system that valued confession over truth. Their stories deserve to be told not as cautionary tales about witchcraft, but as warnings about the ease with which justice can be corrupted. What makes the witch trials particularly haunting is their persistence. The last execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in 1782, in Switzerland, when Anna Goldie was beheaded. That's not medieval history, that's within the lifetime of the United States as a nation. The Witchcraft Act in Britain wasn't repealed until 1951. These persecutions are not ancient history, they are recent enough that they should trouble us deeply. And the underlying attitudes, the mistrust of women's knowledge, the fear of female power, the willingness to believe accusations against those who don't conform, these haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved, taken new forms, found new expressions. The legacy of the witch trials extends into modern attitudes about women's bodies, women's speech, and women's autonomy. The instruments of torture we've examined are now museum pieces, curiosities behind glass, but the mechanisms that enabled their use, the willingness to other, to dehumanize, to accept testimony without evidence, to allow fear to override reason, these remain relevant. Every society must guard against the same forces that turned European and American communities into sites of systematic persecution. We remember these women not just as victims but as human beings who lived, loved, and died in circumstances of unimaginable cruelty. They were daughters and mothers, friends and neighbors. They had hopes and fears, joys and sorrows. The witch trials reduced them to one dimension, guilty or innocent, but they were so much more than that binary could ever capture. As we close this exploration into one of history's darkest chapters, we carry with us both horror and responsibility. Horror at what was done, but responsibility to ensure it's never repeated. We honor these women not through pity but through vigilance, by recognizing the warning signs of mass persecution, by defending the vulnerable, by insisting on evidence over accusation, and by never allowing fear to become the basis for justice. What aspect of these witch trial persecutions troubled you most deeply? How do you see the echoes of these attitudes in modern society? What lessons should we carry forward from this dark history? I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. These conversations matter. They ensure that the voices silenced centuries ago can still speak to us today. If this exploration of history's shadows has been meaningful to you, please consider subscribing to The Hollow Throne. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the events that shaped, scarred, and defined human civilization. Like this video if you found it informative, and share it with others who value understanding our past, no matter how uncomfortable that understanding might be. Thank you for bearing witness to these stories with me. Until next time, remember, we study history not to dwell in darkness but to ensure we never create it again.